Welcome to video number 13 for Ctrl Shift Enter Mastering Excel Array Formulas. Hey, we're in the Workbook Array Formula DVD book. Start on the sheet topics. Hey, last couple of videos we've been talking about functions that can handle array operations and ones that cannot handle array operations. In this video, we want to talk about the index and offset functions that can be used to create dynamic ranges. Now I'm going to click on the link to get to sheet 13. Here I am on sheet 13. And as I've been doing in the last few videos, here is a laundry list of the nuts and bolts of things we've been learning about array formulas through the first 12 videos. All right, let's scroll over here. All right, the first thing we want to do is define a dynamic range. A dynamic range is simply a range that you can use in a formula chart, pivot table, or anywhere else a reference can be used that can expand or contract when you add data. So you can imagine a data set where you're adding records or where you're deleting, and you want your formulas and charts to automatically see when you expand or delete your data set. Now, index and offset functions can return a range of cells, a type of array, but it actually returns a range that can be used in formulas, charts, and other locations that can expect a reference. So that's what we want to look at in this video. Now, I'm mostly going to show you index function, but we're going to look at some offset examples also. Now, the first thing we want to remind ourselves about index. Index function is great to look up a range of cells. It can either look up a row or a column. So we actually saw this calculation back in video 1, and also last video we also saw this. And here's how it works. Index has this array argument, and we have entered a range of values. And this is a two-way range, right? It has some rows and some columns. And the trick for looking up either a row or a column, in our case, we want to look up a column here. I want to, with this criteria February, I want to look up the entire column. But here it is. This is a two-way lookup. So we need a row number and a column number. And then index will take the intersection. But here's the deal. If you put a 0 or omit this argument, which means leave it blank, row number will know to take all the rows. And then match for column number is looking at February, finding the relative position too. So it knows the column. Omitted or 0, please give me all the rows. Now, this index right here, if we highlight this, actually we could come to the sum and simply click that argument right there. Watch what happens when I F9. Oh, that's array syntax. Now, the thing about this is the sum function is going to be able to understand it. Now, normally, when we create an array in our formula, we have to use Ctrl Shift Enter if it's in a function that can't understand arrays, like the sum, right? But check this out. I'm going to Control Z. The first thing to notice is that there are no array calculations in here. But when I hit F9, the output from index is not an array, it's a range. And so there's two things going on here. Control Z, no array calculations, F9, and the index spits out a range, not an array. So that's why the sum function can understand it without Control Shift Enter. No array calculations inside our formula. Index's output is a range, so sum can understand it. Watch this. I'm going to Control Enter. I don't see any curly brackets up there, and it's doing it perfect. It's looking up February and adding it. Now I'm going to change this to January, and sure enough, now it's looking up that column and adding. I'm going to Control Z. All right. This example here is just to show you that the row number can be either 0 or omitted, and it will know to get all the rows. I tend to leave it blank. If we were looking up a column, it's exactly the reverse, meaning that the row number we have to look up, use match to determine which row. That means row 2. And then either, if you see right here, column number, it's either omitted or 0. And that will look up the range, in this case, an entire row, and add. All right, so we want to remember, because we're going to see a lot of examples going through in this video about creating dynamic ranges. If there's no array operation, meaning math, comparative, join, function, argument, in the index formula used to create the range, Ctrl Shift Enter is not required. All right, now dynamic ranges. There's a great built-in feature. We want to talk about Excel table feature. And if you can use it, it's great. But there are some drawbacks, which then leads us to create our dynamic ranged formulas using index or offset function. Now here's a little table. I'm going to convert this to a table. I have field name at the top and records in row. I'm going to go to Insert and Table, or I'm going to simply use the keyboard shortcut Control T. Now notice I just have one cell in the data set selected, Control T. The table has all sorts of amazing advantages. It can filter, it can sort, it could add a total row, and the ranges are dynamic. So I'm going to click OK. Now I want to show you how this works. We're going to do two things. We're going to create a chart and look at the sum function. Now I'm not going to highlight the range because it'll put table nomenclature in, which is fine. But I want to show you something really cool. I'm in C26 colon to C27. Now notice I typed out the number 27. All right, so it adds. Here's another example of its ability to do dynamic ranges. I want to create the default chart. Alt F1, that puts the default chart on this sheet. F11 does the default chart on a new sheet. All right, I'm going to delete everything. All I want is just, I want it really small. And I'm going to delete that. Actually, I can't resist. I do data labels on the outside end. So we see these numbers. Now, check this out. This is a table. So when I click in the last cell in the last record and hit Tab, it adds a new record. When I add 6, boom. That's a dynamic range. That means the chart is pointing to this. If I was to delete this and then grab this and pull this up, it's contracted. Control Z, Z. Now it's expanded. In both cases, the chart, and check this out, that 27 moved to a 28. So I better turn my speak on center cells off. The Excel table feature is great, but there are some drawbacks. Sometimes if you're expanding and contracting a lot, especially when you get down to 0 records, then it can get difficult. Some formulas don't work in tables. Custom views, subtotals, some of those features don't work. So sometimes people don't want to use the table feature. All right, let's scroll down here and look at an alternative to the table feature. And in this example, we're going to see how to use the index function to create a defined name dynamic range formula for text data. Now that we can have different types of data. You can see we have some text data here, number data. You can have mixed data also. And so in this first example, we'll see 4 examples for text data, and then we'll consider numbers and mixed data. All right, so here's a data set. Now I'm going to deal with a very small data set. And I'm only going to highlight in my formula just a few rows past where my records are. When you are creating dynamic range formulas, if the maximum number of records you're ever going to have is 50,000, you need to highlight past 50,000 rows to accommodate the maximum potential number of records. All right, so text. How do we create a dynamic range formula? Now I'm going to create my formula in the cell here. And then once I get it done, I'm going to copy and paste it to the Define Names dialog box. It's just a little bit easier sometimes to work inside of the cell than those dialog boxes. All right, so we're going to deal with text data here. Now notice we have 3 records. There's a couple situations you could get yourself into. Usually you're just entering data like this, right? Occasionally you'll run into a situation where you might have an empty record, which in most cases will not work, whether it's a pivot table or something like that. But we'll see both cases. All right, let's consider the index function. Now let's remind ourselves about the index. Here is the array argument. I'm just going to highlight this range. And again, I'm highlighting just a few records and just a few rows past. The maximum, I'm going to assume the maximum number of records I'll ever have is 3 extra records. I'm going to hit the F4 key. Now, What if I wanted to just look up the last item here? Well, one way to do that is to notice I have text and use for the row number the count function. And so I highlight the same range in F4. Count counts not empty cells. It will deliver a 3, and it will deliver an item. So the index function is doing its job. It's looking through here. It's retrieving row 3. But we want to see how to use the index function, not to retrieve the content of the cells, but the actual cell reference B62. How do you do that? Well, right now, the index is in the context of a regular formula. We need to put it into the context of a range of cells. And here's how you do that. I'm going to consider the very first cell that I could ever have in this range, B60. Now it says B60. And then I'm going to type a colon. Now it puts that B60 in there, and I'm going to backspace. Now you have the index function in the context of a cell reference. Now I'm going to lock this one with the F4, but there it is. Cell reference colon index. Now that index is in the context of a cell reference, it won't look up the content. It'll look up the cell reference. Now let's see this two ways. I'm going to highlight it and hit the F9 key. Now notice it's showing me all the values. Remember, Control Z, this formula doesn't have any array calculations in it, no array operations, and it's the index, so it's delivering a range of cells. Notice F9, we see that array syntax, but don't get fooled. All right, now if I hit Enter, it'll show me implicit intersection. We talked about that in earlier videos. If you want to see the first item in the cell, use Ctrl Shift Enter. Now, I did that Ctrl Shift Enter. I want to use Formula Evaluator to prove that index really did look up the cell reference B62. So I'm going to use the keyboard Alt-MV. Go up to the Formulas ribbon. There's the long way to find Formula Evaluator. And now I could either hit Evaluate or Enter. Counta will be evaluated. Now watch index. B62. That is so cool. Index is now looking up a cell reference. Notice B60 is the first one, and since that's always going to be our start position, there you go. All right, I'm going to close this here. That's one way to do it, but let's check out the problem with that. If I had some text right here, Counta will be delivering 4, and it will look up that 0 in that empty cell, F9. There's not really a 0 there. That's just how the formula treats it. Notice that's not what we want. So if you were ever going to have some potential empties, we're going to need a different method. I'm going to click Escape. Actually, I want to steal this because the remaining 3 examples are going to have the same exact first part. F2 to put in edit mode, Control V. Now, row number. Well, we've already seen a few times in this video series how to look up the last item in a range. The trick is you use a lookup function with approximate match, and the lookup value has to be bigger than anything in the column. So I'm going to use match. And the lookup value here, there's a few ways we could do this. Notice it's text data. But check this out. I learned this trick from Hammy72 at YouTube. We can use the last letter in the Greek alphabet, just a single letter, and it will always get to the end, especially if we're using English words. Now, there's a keyboard to get omega, the last letter in the Greek alphabet. You have to hold the Alt key down, and then on the number pad in succession do 2, 3, 4. So I'm going to Alt 2, 3, 4. And then end double quote. That is going to be my lookup value. Remember, that's going to be bigger than anything we will ever put in this column. So with approximate match, it'll get the last. This is the lookup big thing concept. And we'll see it with numbers and with text. Comma. And then the lookup range is that same range, F4. The default is approximate, so I don't need to put anything there. Close parentheses, close parentheses. If I highlight this and hit the F9 key, To evaluate it, you could see, sure enough, it got this little extra bit here. Control Z, Control Shift Enter. Now, that's one way to do it. Another great way to do it is same thing. We're going to use match, but our big value, our big text value for lookup value is going to be lots of Z's, and we're going to use the repeat function. I don't want to type out a lot of Z's, so I'm going to use the repeat function, which allows me to repeat something. So I'm going to put Z in double quotes, and guess what? I'm going to repeat it 255 times. Let's highlight this. F9. So that is a big text item. It's going to be bigger than anything in this column. Now, why 255? Because the lookup argument in lookup value here, the maximum number of characters it can handle is 255. Now, I learned this cool trick from Aladdin at the Mr. Excel message board. Aladdin, the formula master. Absolutely awesome. So that's the big thing concept. In this case, it's big text. All right, and then comma, the lookup array is here. F4, close parentheses, because we're using the default close parentheses. I highlight this. F9, and I see we got everything. Control, whoops. Uh-oh, I did the cardinal sin when you're using the F9 key and Control Z. Control Z only works one time in formula edit mode. So I can't Control Z and get back. I did 2 operations, so I'm only allowed to go back one. I'll have to fix that. All right, so there you go. Control Shift Enter. All right, still another way to do this. Instead of looking up using the big text concept, I'm going to use the small text concept. And the way this works is the smallest text item we could have is for lookup value is a null text string. So I'm going to put double quote, comma within this range right here. And now we can't use the default. We're going to use -1. That's this not often used third option here. And what it will do is now it's going to look for the smallest value in the column. So when we give it something smaller than will ever be in this column, it'll just keep going until it finds the last one. All right, so that's, and I saw this somewhere online in the last year or so. And so there's another option. Highlight, F9, there you go. Control Z, Control Shift Enter. Now when you time these, all 3 of these are about the same. All 3 of these are about the same, and this one is a little bit longer. Now, these are 4 examples here. We're going to see about 9 examples of these formulas, and then we'll go ahead and time them. All right, now let's go ahead. I'm going to pick this one right here and put it up in define names. Now, you could just use this right in any formula as a dynamic range. I copy that, Control C, escape. I'm going to use the keyboard shortcut, Control F3, name managers up in the formulas ribbon. I'm going to say new text column or something like that. Then I'm going to highlight and Control V. So I can see that there, and then click OK. Oh, here's a great trick. Once you've clicked OK, you can come down here to this collapse button and click it and see if it's getting the right range. The dancing ants will tell you if it's the correct range or not. All right, I'm going to click Close. And now let's see if we can use it in our formula. I don't know. I could use some formula or some whatever I'm doing. I'm just going to count I've already done that within this. But I want to count how many things are in this dynamic expanding and contracting range. So I'm going to, hey, I forgot my name. Oh, there's a keyboard shortcut to allow you to paste the name, F3. And I have my big text. Big text. So I'm going to double click that and enter. And so there it is. If I delete this, it automatically knows. If I put something in both of these, it knows to get 5. And by the way, you can just use the dynamic range right in your formula. So there it would be. I mean, this would be a ridiculous formula here, but I'm just showing you how you could use this. And notice I didn't hit Control Shift Enter. There's no curly brackets up there. All right, and so that the two things about this, even though we highlight it and hit the F9 and see that array syntax, there's no array calculation anywhere in this, and the index output is a range of cells. I promise you later we'll see some great applications for these defined names. We're just kind of learning the nuts and bolts here. All right, let's scroll down and look at our next example. We've got to look at how to do number data. All right, so we want a dynamic range for this column here. So I'm going to put equals, that first cell reference, colon, and index. The range, highlight as far past as you need, F4, comma, and same match, and the lookup value. The lookup value we're going to choose is the biggest number possible. Now, you can put any big number here for lookup value that's going to always be bigger than anything in the column. But here's the biggest number that Excel, this is an approximation within a couple points here or there of the biggest number Excel can see. There's a 9 point and then 14 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Excel sees up to 15 significant digits, and then scientific notation E plus 307. Big num. I learned that one from Aladdin at the Mr. Excel message board. He always says, hey, might as well, if you're using big numbers, put the biggest number that Excel knows, and then you're never going to get in trouble. All right, so I'm going to highlight that same range, F4. The default is approximate match, close parentheses, close parentheses. If I highlight, zip, oops, I forgot to lock this one. If you're going to paste it up into the define names dialog box, that's very important. F9, and there we go. Control Z, Control Shift Enter. If I were to put something here, now it will see it. F9, Control Z, Escape. All right, and now what are we going to do if we have mixed data? Well, we actually seen this formula before. I'm actually going to just copy this from my notes here. And in edit mode, Control V. Now, we saw this when we looked up the last city, and we had one other lookup last example in earlier videos. But we created an array, and since it's mixed data, I just say, hey, give me a true or false for when it's not empty. Notice there's duplicates here. If I converted this trues and falses, like with multiplying or double negative, the false would be a 0. And that wouldn't work because we're looking up the big number here, and that 0 would be picked up as a number, so it would keep going till the end. So that's why we divide by 0. So we're converting the trues and falses with any math operation. We chose division, F9, because now the divide by 0 flat out is not a number, so the 2 won't get affected by it. Now the 2 has the chance to find that 1. Why 2? Because that is a big number, right? We're never going to get anything but 1s because those were trues. Control Z. Now that match will find the position, and so the row number, F9, and there is the fourth position, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now check this out. This is an array calculation, and it's sitting in an argument, lookup array argument of match, which cannot handle array calculations without Control Shift Enter. So if you were actually going to scoop this out and use it in a formula instead of doing define names, you'd have to use Control Shift Enter. Maybe I'll show you that and just copy. I'm going to Control Shift Enter, just show the first value. If I were going to count, counta and equals counta, Control V. And I'm showing these silly examples here. But if I hit Enter, it just gives me some implicit intersection. But if I Control Shift Enter, now it has a chance to work. It's counting how many different bits of data there. Again, that's a silly example, right? Because we have a great example coming up for how to use these. But we're just learning the nuts and bolts. All right, and if you were to put that up into a define name, guess what? Define names can handle array formulas with array calculations regardless of their Control Shift Enter or not. All right, now that is a way to do mixed data. Now we want to come over here and talk about tables, because oftentimes we'll have a VLOOKUP example later where we have a table or pivot tables. You need to figure out how to do a whole entire table. Now I'm not going to type these values out, but here's our data set. We have text, number, number, but I want the whole table, say for VLOOKUP, because our next example will be VLOOKUP. One way to do it is to highlight the upper left corner and then look up the last number in this column. That way, that colon right there, because index is looking up the last one here, it'll deliver D104. So if I Alt-MV for Formula Evaluator and enter, you can see that sure enough, index is delivering D104, and we hard-coded the upper left B101 there. Now, what if you had something like this? By the way, that's number formatting there. You had some rogue data right in the middle. Well, of course, this one's not going to pick it up because we're looking for the last one in this column. It just flat out is not going to work, right? It doesn't pick that up. So if you wanted to do that and pick it up, you'd have to do something like this. So I'm still in the row number argument, but I had to build an array calculation. And I wanted to find the max possible row that has data in this range. So I created an array of trues and falses that says, hey, is anything in there not empty? If I hit F9, you could see it gives me array syntax. Comma means column, 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 then go down to the next row. Comma, 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 then go down to the next row. But notice we have a little rogue true way over here representing that 2. Control Z. So now I simply saw this little formula element earlier because we need row numbers here. So if I hit F9, this is our way of creating 1 through 7. So even though this is a rectangular range, and this is just a single column with row, 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 Control Z, when I highlight this inside the max and hit, oh, I could do this little trick again, boop, and hit the F9, you could see we get all of these row numbers, but that one rogue little 6. And here, Control Z, we used multiplying F9, right? So these zeros are not going to affect a max calculation. We've seen a few other times in this video series where if we're looking for the smallest number, then we can't use multiplying because the 0 will mess everything up. But no problem. The max inside of row number, F9, that'll give us our 6. And index will know to go down this column to the 6th position, so it will be taking the entire table. Control Z. If I highlight this and hit the F9, you know, those extra little blank, so these are empty, an empty row and some empty cells. In a lot of situations, that might cause trouble, but in some situations, you might want it. So that's how you'd create a dynamic range, even if there was rogue data. Now, here we did an array calculation. So if we're going to use it in a formula, we have to use Ctrl Shift Enter, or you can just paste it into the Define Names dialog box. That thing doesn't care about whether it's an array formula or not. It will understand it. I'm going to Ctrl Shift Enter. If you were going to use it in a formula, you might want to consider this. The aggregate is a 2010 function. And we saw earlier how to use the number 15 to tell aggregate to do a small calculation. Well, 14 tells aggregate to do a large calculation. And then you simply, in the array, you do that same calculation, F9, and it will pick out, because the 14 means find the large, and the 1 will say find the number 1 large, and it will find that 6. And aggregate can do the array calculations without Control Shift Enter. Control Z. All right, now that's regular data set with rogue data, right? Now let's do our example. We want to see how to do VLOOKUP and data validation, including if we start adding extra records. So I'm going to go ahead. I've already created the formula here. And I'm going to look in the first column. So I'm going to use this formula here with repeat Z a bunch of times. Control C. This is going to be for my data validation drop-down list, so it's dynamic. As I add new products, the list will expand. Control F3. I'm going to say new and create data validation list. So I just called it that and then paste it down here. Delete and Control V. Now, we did define names once already in this video, but I want to point something out. I forgot to point out earlier. Notice that we not only locked all of these cell references, but that you don't see any sheet references there, right? I'm going to click OK. Now you can see some sheet references here. If I click Edit, sheet references are put in OK. So it automatically puts those sheet references in. So this defined name dynamic range is available everywhere. I'm going to click Close. Now I'm going to do the same thing for the VLOOKUP. I use the upper corner and I search for the last number in this. So that will work for the table. Control C, Escape, Control F3 for define names. I'm going to say new. I'm going to call this VLOOKUP table. Delete. All right, hit backspace, Control V. There are the locked cell references, but when I click OK, they turn to sheet references. I'm going to check this table right here. Boop. Looks like it's working. I'm going to unboop that. Now I'm going to check this one here. Is it getting it right? It sure is. The dancing ants tell you if you got it right or not. Close. All right, now let's do data validation list. Alt-DL. I don't want to allow anything. I want to hit Tab and L for list. Tab. I don't remember my name, so I'm going to hit F3. And it's data validation list, so I double click it, and there you go. Now I'm going to check this out. There it is. Wow. All right, now I'm going to do equals VLOOKUP. The lookup value is going to be whatever I selected from the data validation, comma, F3 to get my name. Oh, yeah, it's VLOOKUP table. It's fine to just type those out, right? As soon as you get your drop down, there's a dog tag, and you can just double click it, comma. That's in the third. The cost is what I want to return. I'm definitely doing exact match because the first column is not sorted. And there we go. Now let's go ahead and add a new record. And this is 3 inches and 0.85. I can see I haven't formatted the whole column. Here, watch. Here's a dangerous trick. I'm going to copy this all the way down, point to the Smart tag, and say fill formatting only. All right, now let's drum roll. Did my data validation list? Yes, it did. It has my new product and is VLOOKUP pulling the right price. Oh, I have the wrong format there. I'm going to use the keyboard shortcut Ctrl Shift 4 for currency. So there we go. Expanding, contracting. If I were to delete this, hit the delete key. Now the list has just totally changed, and there it's looking it up properly. All right, let's look at a couple other things you might encounter. What if you had a formula deliver a null text string delivered by a formula or an extra space? Well, the rule of thumb is for data sets is that you really don't want to put extra stuff or type below your expandable contractible data set. So if you're setting something like this up, you probably want to have a rule that you don't put data down here. But what if you did? Well, you could add. This is our same formula we did earlier with max and an array calculation not empty in rows. The only thing is we added the trim function, and the trim function removes all spaces except for single spaces between words. You could see count is getting 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That formula delivered null text string. If you use the length function to figure out how len function to figure out how many characters there are, it'll tell you 0. But there is something there, and counta, because these cells are not empty, counts them. All right, we want to talk about offset. Offset is a great function along with index. Now, here's some notes here, but I'm just going to jump in and look at the offset. Offset you start by giving it a reference. Now I'm going to click in the top cell that I want here, an F4. That first argument says where to start. Now it can be a single cell or it could be a range of cells. Comma, the 4 remaining arguments define the size and shape based on this starting point. Now rows, that means how many rows down or up do you want to move from the starting point. So since we don't want to move any, you either put 0 or omitted. Columns means from the starting point, do you want to move left or right any columns? If you don't, you put 0 or omitted. Now, if you want to move columns left or right, notice I'm in B. To go back 1, I'd have to put a -1. To put forward 1, I'd have to put a +1 or +2 or whatever. It's the same with the rows. Adding rows is a positive number. Subtracting rows is a minus number. These first 2 arguments, rows and columns, it means how far do you want to move from that starting position. Once those 2 things have determined the starting position, then you have to give it the height. Well, I'm going to use the count function because I'm never going to have any empty records. And I'm going to only have numbers. So right now, count will deliver 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that will be the height. I'm going to hit F4. Comma. Now, width, you could comma and say 1. Or you can assume the default. And the default is always based on the reference, either the height or the width, which I didn't put in here. If you leave those out, it will assume whatever the width and height is of the reference. That's that starting position right there, reference. All right, so since that reference is 1 column wide, the width, I'm going to leave it off. And now you can see if I highlight this and hit the F9 key, there it is. Control Z. And it delivers a reference also. If I hit Enter, it's giving me implicit intersection. You could use this in define names also. All right. Now, actually, let's go ahead and use this. And I'm going to show you how to create a chart. Chart is one of these great things that people like to have dynamic, right? So we want our chart. Let's go ahead and take that offset. I copied it and made sure everything is locked. Control F3. And I'm going to say new and call this chart data. No spaces with your name up there. Highlight this, backspace, Control V. Click OK. I'm going to test it. Oh, there we go. Absolutely beautiful. You can see the sheet references are put in. Click Close. Now I'm going to just highlight this range here and create the default chart. Control F1. Do a little cleanup here. Might as well add a one way to do it is to go up and notice if you have the columns highlighted, you can use the series function up in the formula bar and replace. But that gets a little tricky, and sometimes it's harder to do there. But might as well just go to the design and select data. Actually, this button is the trick to all charting. Select data, because you can edit, add, and delete any ranges and build your charts just the way you want. Here's the static range here. I'm going to click Edit. And here's the trick. You want to come to series values. You have to leave the sheet name in and the syntax, the little apostrophes in the explanation, and highlight only the range. Then delete it or hit backspace and put your name. I hit F3 key and I'm going to take my chart data. Now notice, look at this. There's sheet reference and the define name. When I click OK, that is going to change. If I come back and look at it in edit mode and click this collapse button, you can see now it has the name of the workbook and then .xlsm exclamation point and then the defined name. That is what's supposed to happen. I'm going to click the uncollapse. Click OK. Click OK. OK, let's try this. I'm going to come here and type 189. And just like that, my chart is expanding. If I were to delete this, it contracts. Absolutely beautiful. My dynamic range using offset and define names. And now I know how to use it, put it into charts. It's all about that select data. All right, let's scroll down here. A couple more examples. Now, we want to see here, if I select a city, SF or Tacoma, I want a dynamic drop-down. So if I select Tacoma, I want to see a drop-down over in this cell showing just the names, the customers for Tacoma. If I change this to SF, I want to see just the names here in a drop-down. All right? I'm going to show you two different ways. And this one will get a little bit tricky right here. We'll use offset and index. All right, offset. Well, where are we always going to start? The reference. Well, I want customer names. I'm actually going to click on the field name just because part of our formula is going to move down once it finds the starting position for our city. So that's going to be my starting position. I'm always going to, comma, move down a certain number of rows. Now, we got to think, if it's SF, how far do I need to move down from that blue reference? 1, right? There's SF. If I changed it to Tacoma, I would have to go down 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, I can use the match function with exact match. There are duplicates here. So if I use exact match and look up the city name, it'll always give me the relative position, which is the first time it sees it in the list. So for rows, match will work just fine. I'm looking up this F4, comma, within this range right here. F4, comma, 0. It's got to be exact match. All right, so that's the rows. Again, if it's Tacoma, it'll start from this blue and go 1, 2, 3, 4, because Tacoma is the 4th item in that list right there. Now, columns. Columns, I don't need to move anywhere. I don't need to move left or right from that starting position, so I'm going to keep the default. The height. Well, what is the height going to be for SF? 1, 2, 3. What's the height going to be if there's Tacoma here? 1, 2. So I'm simply going to do a COUNTIF based on this criteria in this column here. So height, COUNTIF. The range, F4, comma, and there's the criteria F4, close parentheses. All right? So there's the height. The width, I could put a 1 here, but I'm going to assume the default, which is the width of that reference there, 1. If I highlight this here in F9, sure enough for SF it got there. Control Z, Control Shift Enter. If I change this to Tacoma, now if I highlight this and hit F9, no way. That is absolutely beautiful. All right, Control Shift Enter. Now let's see how to do this with index. Now with index, it's going to be a little bit more complicated formula with more stuff to type out than the offset. But what's the big advantage to index? Index is not a volatile function. Offset is a volatile function. Volatile means that anytime Excel recalculates, the function will recalculate, even if nothing is changed over here. And down here under point number 19, there's some things that cause recalculation. Things like entering any new data, inserting a row, deleting, hiding columns, all sorts of things will cause recalculation. So in big spreadsheets where calculation time is slow, it may be wise to not use offset. So then even though this formula here will be a little bit more difficult, it won't be volatile. All right, now here's the trick to index. What if we're doing Tacoma? That means we have to actually look up the cell reference C59 and then have another index that looks up C160. So let's do the first, because we can look up the first cell reference in this range by simply using an exact match. So if it was Tacoma, it would be easy to get that first cell reference, C59. So I'm going to say equals index and the array, that's the range of values, the cell references we potentially want to look up, F4, comma, and the row number. Well, I simply do match. I'm looking up to comma, F4, within this range right here, F4, and I'm going to do exact match because I want to find the first one. Right? So if I Control Enter, you can see it's getting GG. Well, it's not in the context of the cell reference. Now, we're going to have to just change this a little bit to get the second one. But how do we tell index to look up a cell reference? Colon, and then Control V. The only difference is, think about for Tacoma. If right now, with this exact match, it's looking up the fourth one. Well, what if I subtracted the total count for, added the total count for Tacoma? It would go 1, 2, and then subtracted 1, it would work perfect. Notice for San Francisco, if this was San Francisco, I'd get this as the starting position. But if I counted San Francisco, it would be 3. So I could go 1, 2, 3, and then subtract 1, and it would give me the ending cell. So we simply have to, and I'll even get rid of the, there it is, the row number. It's match right now. If I highlight this and hit F9, it's 4. But this is the second index, and I need it to go down one more. Control Z. So I add count if all of the cities, F4, comma, the criteria, F4. That's always going to give me 1 too many, so I subtract 1. There for row number. F9, that gives me 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Index will know to get the cell reference, C160, Control Z. Now I'm going to close parentheses, highlight it. F9, you got to be kidding me. Control Z, Control Shift Enter. If I change this to SF, if I highlight this, and F9, absolutely beautiful. Control Shift Enter. All right, so for our dynamic dropdown, I'm going to use this one right here. Control, make sure I have all the absolute cell references. Control C in edit mode. Control F3. New. This is going to be, I just type dynamic data validation. I'll highlight down here, backspace, Control V. Wow, that's a big one. Click OK. I'm going to check it right here. No way. That is so amazing. Click Close. All right, now I come over here. Alt-DL, Tab, L, Tab, F3. I think it's Dynamic Data Validation, right? And then click OK. So right now it says SF. Oh, that is so cool, Joe. But what if I change it to Squim? Now the drop down changes to Willie and Dana. Absolutely awesome. All right, so index or offset. Here's a little table. Index is not volatile. Offset is easy to use. Well, it kind of depends on your point of view. I tend to stick with index, but offset's pretty cool too. Recalculation time. Those are all the things. That's straight from Microsoft Help. Many of the things that can cause recalculation. All right, let's go to our next example. All right, let's scroll down. We got 2 last examples. Oh, number 20 is a great trick here. Sometimes you want to add the last 5 or look up the last 5 for whatever calculation, or the last 20 or 30 or however it is. You have this expandable list, and you're only interested in the last so many. So we can build a dynamic range for the last so many. We're going to do 5, right? We have a small data set here. The only trick is, do you want to include empty cells or not? So the first example, sometimes you do. Sometimes you just want the last 5, even if there was an empty, right? Maybe there weren't any sold on that day. So here's the formula, and we want to add in this case. Here's the formula for that. The trick is, we're going to do index colon index. So what we're doing is we're looking up 2 cell references. For this first example, I need a range that's dynamic from B189 to B193. Well, the 193 part of it, the second cell reference in our range, is easy. We just do match with a big number, and it will find that position. It's finding this one that's a little bit tricky. Well, it's not that tricky. We'll just do the same thing. We'll find the position of the last one and subtract 5. Actually, we won't subtract 5. But here is the second index. And notice I took the match. To get the position, we use the big number concept in there. So, of course, it's going to find that cell reference B193. For before the colon, that means that cell reference right there, 89, I took the match. Oh, yeah, I just find the last one and then subtract the 5 right there. And because that's one too many, we add 1 back in. So that will work, and it's beautiful. It'll always get the last 5, even if I start typing numbers here, right? So there it is. That sum function is automatically updating as I add or delete records. All right. So how are we going to change this to exclude that? Well, let's look at this data set. What if we asked a question like, is any data in here a number? We get false, false, true, true, false, true, true, true. Well, we could take that array of trues and falses and multiply it by an array of numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. If we multiplied, then the 5 here would be times the false, because that cell is not a number. And so we'd get an array of relative positions 7, 6, 4, 3, 2. Then from that array, we ask the question, which one is the 5th biggest? And that's how we're going to get cell B88. Again, finding the last one here is easy. We do match with the big num. So I'm actually going to copy this and put it over here. And so we have this colon. There's the index. That one's going to work just fine because it's looking up that last B193. It's only the first index for the first cell reference, that row number argument. So I'm going to highlight that and hit delete. All right, so I want the large, and then I want an array of relative positions. So in that array, I'm going to say if, and then is number. The is number can look through here. It delivers trues and falses. I'm going to hit F4. Right, so if I logical test that and click that and F9 it to evaluate, I can see true, false, true. And so there's that false that's going to help us skip over the 5th empty cell, Control Z. Now I say if is number, and then I come to the end of the logical test right there, comma, then we have to create our formula element that creates an array of relative positions. So row of all of them, F4, minus row of the first one, F4, plus 1. If we highlight this and hit the F9 key, you can see there it gives me all. That's all of them. But the is number will only give us the ones that are have numbers. So now I'm going to very carefully come to the end here and close parentheses. Now I need to put a K. Actually, let's do this. Boop, and hit the F9 on the if. And sure enough, you can see there's our array only of the row numbers that have numbers in them. And now we can ask the question, give me the 5th biggest. It'll be the second one right there. Control Z. I didn't get that right. I didn't click. These screen tips for these big formulas are just absolutely mandatory. Comma. And then the K, well, I want, right, there's a K. We want the 5th largest, and then F4. Close parentheses. And now I'm going to click on this row number here and hit the F9 key. And there it is. That's how this index is going to look up the cell reference B88, because it's the second cell reference in that range there. Control Z. Now, this one is going to require Control Shift Enter because there's an array calculation here. Anytime, yeah, we have an array calculation. We've seen the if before. The if will trump any other function that may not require Control Shift Enter for an array calculation. This trumps it. So this is an array calculation, so we have to use Control Shift Enter. If I just hit Enter, it's not going to work. Control Shift Enter, and there we go. This requires Control Shift Enter in the cells, but not up in the Define Names dialog box. So Define Names dialog box understands array formulas or non-array formulas. It's all the same to them. All right, let's scroll down and look at our last example. All right, here we have a column, and we need a formula as we copy it down that will always count how many grades are greater than 2.5, but only for the quarter. So we want one formula we can copy down. Here's how you do it longhand, right? I'd say count if that range right there greater than or equal to the 2.5. When I get here, I somehow need the range to change. Down here, I need it to change yet again. Now, doing it manually, if you had thousands of rows, would be torture, right? So that's where a dynamic range that changes like this would come in handy. Then we have one formula to copy down. Now, the trick here is noticing that there's a pattern here. Text. So when I get down to this cell right here, we can define this range by two endpoints, because we're going to use the index. We're going to need this first cell, C99, and the last cell, C202. The C202 will be easy. That'll be a relative cell reference. It's only going to be that one. How in the world are we going to look that up? But notice, the pattern is that there's text, right? So the last bit of text in this column over here is that. When somehow I switch down to here, the last little bit of text, if I had an expandable range as I copy down, would be there. So that's going to be our marker to determine where the start point in our range is. All right, let's look at an index formula here. I want to start off by seeing if I could look up the first grade. So if I copy this formula down, at least it will be looking up the first grade for each quarter. So the trick is, one of the tricks here is to highlight two cells, lock the first one with the F4. That makes it an expandable range. That's locked. This is not. As we copy down, it will expand. And now I want to look up this number here, but when I copy down here, it should be looking up 2.1. So for the row number, I'm going to use match. And I'm going to use the big text concept we learned earlier. Double quote, and I'm going to use Greek omega. So Alt, and then on the keyboard pad, 2, 3, 4. End double quote. And I'm going to look up, that's big text. I'm going to look it up within that range. And this is going to be the same expandable range. Now with big text or big number, it's always approximate. I'm going to close parentheses. Now let's Control Enter. And just notice what this does. It's going to get me 3.8 all the way down. Now notice how these ranges are expanding, right? But when I get down here, what is matched? What position for this blue range is match determining? That one right there, because now the last text item in this column is that Win-2012. All right, so now we know index, if it's not in the context of cell references, just look stuff up. Now let's put it in the context of a cell reference, colon, relative cell reference. Now this is going to create an array of values. I'm going to Ctrl Shift Enter and drag it down. But we can use Formula Evaluator to check this out. Highlight, or just the F9 trick. F9. Sure enough, look at that. It's got all of those values. Escape. Let's do it here. F9. Sure enough, it's got those values. If I Alt MV and run Formula Evaluator, the match has got 2. The index gets, there it is, C199 to C202. Absolutely beautiful. Now we can use this. Now notice, are there any array calculations here? Does index deliver a range? Yes, it does. Even though we see it when we F9, whoops, we see it when we F9 here as we see array syntax, we know that this really isn't an array. So we're going to put this into the count if function range. Now we already had a whole video on and showing examples of the fact that the range argument cannot handle arrays. But guess what? Since index is spitting out a reference and there's no array calculations here, it'll work perfectly. So then the criteria is greater than, in double quotes, ampersand, F99, F4. And you've got to be kidding me. Control Enter, no Control Shift Enter. I don't see any curly brackets there. Double click and send it down. Now all we have to do is add a little bit. There's our 3. That's the count of grades greater than or equal to 2.5. Here we get a proper count of only 1. Now we can amend this. If, and I'm going to look one cell over and one cell down. That way, when I get to right here, it's looking at winter. And I'm going to say, is that not empty? If it's not empty, then the value of true is that COUNTIF. Otherwise, the value with false is going to be null text string, close parentheses, Control Enter, double click and send it down. Wow. All right, so that's our last example for this video. We saw a lot about index and offset and about creating dynamic ranges. We talked a lot about big num and big text. Talked about how index and offset create these amazing ranges. And near the end of the video, we saw some great, amazing uses for dynamic ranges. All right, next video is video 14. We'll talk about Boolean logic. We'll see you next video.